I want to welcome you all this evening. It's so exciting to see so many people attending one of our virtual programs. We will be doing this for quite a while, so I'm very glad everybody's getting used to it and joining us. We are working very hard to be the best possible virtual Jewish museum in the world, and tonight is only adding to that reputation. We are very excited about our speaker tonight, but let me just say a few housekeeping things before we start. Please make sure you stay muted. You can put your view on speaker only, so you just see Gerald. At the end, we will be having questions and answers. We'll be saving about 15 minutes for that. You can write your questions into the chat, and then Luna, our education director, will call upon you when we get to the question and answer part. I hope everybody's okay and clear with that. So it is my great pleasure tonight to be able to have as our guest Gerald Posner, award-winning author who also happens to be a member of our Miami Beach community, along with his wife Tricia Posner, who in herself is an award-winning author. And she'll be joining us for the question and answer section. Gerald began his writing career with his first book in 1986, Mengele: The Complete Story, which was the result of him having done some pro bono legal work for some of the Mengele twins from Auschwitz. And he's been a full-time author ever since, and leading up to his newest book, which is called Pharma, Read Lies and the Poisoning of America. It's an incredibly timely subject for all of us, and I can see that you all agree since so many of you have signed on today. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce you to our very special guest, Gerald Posner.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Susan, for the great introduction. And it's great to be back at the Jewish Museum of Florida. And I've seen some friends log in already. This is an opportunity where normally we get to see friends, neighbors, colleagues, those who live around us who we haven't run into for a long time, especially given COVID. And unfortunately, when I saw this event on the calendar, I kept hoping that things might mean an in-person book event, but it wasn't to be, alas. So here we are virtual once again. And I must say that, for those of you, by the way, the good news about virtual is that you don't have to be in Miami Beach. So I know that there are people from a lot of different locations who are here tonight who are also listening. If you don't know the Jewish Museum of Florida, you should. When Trish and I started to visit the Miami area in 1989, we were regular visitors to the museum and its wonderful, rich history of Jewish life in Florida itself, and the exhibits that they have that are very, very special over time. If you're local, you should become a member and support them. And if you're visiting Miami Beach for the beach and the food and all the wonderful fun, you should also make a point of stopping by the museum. And as Susan said, Trish and I have been here before. When we moved to Florida, finally in 2003, we moved a few blocks away, not just because it was the Jewish Museum, but we found a place that was very nearby. And we have been there to talk before, myself about Joseph Mengele, and most recently about God's Bankers, my book on the finances of the Vatican. Tricia has been there talking about the Channel Islands in World War II and the Nazi occupation in her last book, The Pharmacists of Auschwitz. And tonight will be the first time we're at the museum virtually. I'll be talking about this presentation of the book. And as Susan said, Tricia, who's about 5 feet away from here, anybody who knows us knows she can't be that far away, will join us for the questions and answers after. It's a bit like you have to get through the broccoli and the gluten-free bread and all the healthy stuff first that I'm going to feed up to you in the presentation. Then you get the dessert, which is getting the better Posner and the team of us to be able to field some questions in a little bit. And right before getting into the subject of pharma, one comment about the virtual nature of this. The Pharma itself, the book, was published on March 10th. That was the date that Simon & Schuster Avid Reader Press, my publisher, had set for the publication months beforehand. So those of you who aren't in publishing may not know, the book is set, it's put into a catalog. The copies are printed out, it's sold to bookstores, to book chains, to Barnes & Noble, to everybody else. They order thousands of copies. A book's tour is scheduled and built around it, and you're booked weeks in advance. So the book was published on March the 10th. On March the 11th, the world Health Organization declared the coronavirus a pandemic. And a few days later, all the bookstores in the United States, as had bookstores already in Europe, closed, leaving only Amazon as the outlet. A 16-city book tour was canceled. And so we are accustomed to doing book events virtual. The downside is I've learned the pluses and the minuses of a virtual event. The benefit for you as listeners is you get to log in. And I only see a handful of people at the front. And so when it's a large group like this approaching near 100, it's possible that you can log in and then go off and do your email in the next room or watch TV or talk to a friend. I may not even know it. When I'm giving a talk in person, if somebody's getting a little drowsy and nodding off, I may have to pick up the pace, but here I can't quite tell that. The benefit for me is I can't see people leaving the room though as well. So that's always a good sign. But if I'm saying something that I think might remotely be humorous, I can't tell if it gets a reaction. If I tell you something that I think is shocking, if I don't see jaws drop open, and I can't in a virtual world, it's hard to be able to determine. So what I miss, and I think a lot of readers miss as well, is that feedback that comes in terms of a personal event, knowing that you can actually get together, schmooze a little bit, talk, exchange ideas about the book, and there's an interplay that takes place in person that you can't have here. The last feature is, Tricia long believed, because my mother, my late mother, was a first-generation Italian-American, and the DNA that I have is that she used to think I couldn't talk without the use of my hands. And for those of you who have seen me in person, hand talk seems to be pretty important. Sitting here at a desk with Zoom and a little webcam on, it's not as easy to start waving my hands across without seeming very, very disconcerting to everybody. So I have learned, for the most part, although my hands may be moving a little bit here at the bottom of the screen, but for the most part, I've learned to talk without my hands. So that's one of the benefits of having done a Zoom book tour over time. And one of the things that, before getting into the selective history that I'm going to give you tonight, and I do mean selective history, I'm going to give you just part of what this is about. I'm very lucky to have a publisher who allows me to come up with an idea or a subject and then go off and do the research and reporting on it. That doesn't happen a lot in publishing anymore. Publishers want to know what the book is about before they agree to publish it. You've got to tell them, if you haven't done your research, what you think your conclusions are. I never know that, because it takes that year, 2, 3 years of going out with Tricia, doing the interviews, finding the documents to find out what the story is. So I'm lucky to be able to have that. In this case, it turned out to be a much broader, much bigger scope and ambition than we had even imagined when first proposing Pharma. So tonight I can touch on parts of it, but I can't touch on everything. And I'll give you an idea. Since the book's come out and it's received a great reception, rave reviews, some of you who follow our social media will know that it's currently up for the Best Business Book Award by the Society of Business Editors and Writers, who are doing it for the first time with Investopedia. That award will come out next month, a small select short list of books that includes some great competition. But in addition, the main reviews from newspapers have been great. And there's a word that a number of them have used that I just want to mention very quickly. You might find it interesting. Very seldom do reviews use the same word, and this was an unusual one. The New York Times, in describing the book like a pharmaceutical version of Cops and Robbers, says it's a withering and encyclopedic indictment of the drug industry. Booklist called it an encyclopedic expose, and the Pittsburgh Post-Gazette said an encyclopedic act of reporting. Now, encyclopedic as in large, wide scope, big book, I get that. That's another reason why I'm giving you tonight what will be a very selective history. So the book includes chapters on things like orphan drugs, and many people may say, orphan what? Something I knew nothing about before I started this process, an unusual part of the law passed by Congress in the early 80s to give pharmaceutical companies some extra incentive to create drugs for small patient populations with rare genetic diseases. It's gamed and jury-rigged and abused right and left, and some of the most expensive drugs in the world are in fact orphan drugs. There's a chapter on that, but we're not getting really into that tonight. Pharmacy benefit managers. Everybody's paying attention to the Supreme Court and what's going on with the latest nomination for the court. Few have noticed that the court agreed last week to see a case on pharmacy benefit managers. Who are, you say what? multi-billion-dollar corporations that have since the 1980s put themselves in the middle of the drug distribution program. And I have a long, extensive chapter on that. The second and last chapter in the book is called The Coming Pandemic. Infectious disease doctors interviewed with us 4 years ago told us that it was only a matter of time, not if, a pandemic would come about. And what they worried about was a bacteriological pandemic, one like the Black Plague that had ravaged Europe in the Middle Ages, where we don't have an antibiotic to fight it because we have antibiotic resistance from the overuse of antibiotics. They weren't even as worried about a viral pandemic like coronavirus. So imagine their fears were even worse than what we're going through now, which seems pretty bad to me. And the opioid crisis, about a third of the book turns out to be about the opioid crisis. I have a chapter near the end called Essentially a Crime Family. It's a quote from somebody about the billionaire Sackler family, the owners of Purdue Pharma, whose OxyContin was the blockbuster opioid painkiller that's become the poster child for the greatest prescription drug epidemic ever, that's killed hundreds of thousands of people and made millions of people in addicts and ravaged lives. So there's a lot about that as well. Now that I've told you about all the things I'm not talking about in great detail, I'm going to take you back a little bit to how this book came about very quickly, and then a little bit of the history of what made the drug industry in America the drug industry that we know, and how Tricia and I, in researching it, made some left and right turns that were unexpected based upon the research that we came across. So the idea for this actually comes 23 years ago. In 1997, I was researching a book on the assassination of Martin Luther King. And in the course of doing that research, I called up another reporter. He was an 85-year-old legendary investigative reporter, Jim Phelan. He worked for the Saturday Evening Post. He was the one who broke the story about Clifford Irving having done a hoax on Howard Hughes for the autobiography, all types of great stories. We shared the same editor at Random House, Bob Loomis, at the time. And I called up Phelan because I needed some advice on research I'd come across in the King assassination. We got to talking about the state of investigative journalism, how it was hard to get the space in a magazine and necessarily in the time to really look into subjects. And I got around to asking him what he would do if he was going to do another book. And he said, oh, without missing a beat, he said, oh, I do the drug industry. It's like throwing a dart at a storyboard. There's so much in there. It's so rich. It's a great story to do for somebody who has the time. He didn't have the time. I didn't know. He didn't tell me then that he was dying of cancer. And when I later learned of his death, long before he ever started to do anything on that, I talked to Tricia about that, and we put it in the back of our mind, and we said, you know, one day it would be great to do a book about the drug industry. Well, publishing sometimes takes other things come in front of it. So after the book that was done on the assassination of King, I ended up doing a book on Motown Records, and then 9/11 happened. I ended up doing a book called Why America Slept. Then another book was done on Saudi Arabia, a book on the history of Miami Beach before the story was finally done on the God's Bankers, which was the story of money inside the Vatican. Tricia, in the meantime, had done a book called This Is Not Your Mother's Menopause, and then a book about No Hormones, No Fear, and finally her book, Pharmacists of Auschwitz. So it took a long time, nearly 20 years, before we finally got back to the point where we were working on the book on the drug industry. Approached Simon & Schuster, and they said yes. And 5 years later, here we are. The first year on this book was what I call a self-crafted 101 dummies course for medical school. We had to jump into trying to understand enough about drug language, the technicalities of the pharmaceutical industry, and enough about medicine itself, so that when we went out and started the first round of interviews with doctors and infectious disease specialists and pharmaceutical researchers, we would know enough to have intelligent interviews. And that was a real tough hurdle. It was one that I never had before, because every other subject, whether it was about the Vatican or about money or about 9/11 or chasing the FBI or whatever else, was a subject that I had enough of an understanding that I was able to start from the very beginning by jumping in. This required a learning curve because I don't have a medical degree. I didn't study in the sciences, and I knew that I had to be fully conversant with it before going out and sitting down with somebody who would otherwise have to explain to me what was happening and then wouldn't give me a serious interview. What surprised us was that what we thought was a business that started really about World War II with the advent of penicillin goes all the way back to the mid 1800s. And the companies that we know today, that's where they have their DNA. That's where they started. And why in the mid 1800s, you might wonder. That's because there was suddenly this tremendous boom in demand for morphine because wars were being fought, the Mexican-American War and then the Civil War. And the death and destruction in those wars created this demand for morphine that could not be met by the small companies that were producing it. And there was a flood into the battle lines and the front lines of adulterated morphine that had been watered down and somehow been not tested correctly. And it caused all types of problems. And as a result, some people saw a business opportunity in that. So a couple of German cousins, first generation German cousins in Brooklyn, Charles Pfizer and his cousin had $2,500 in savings and a $1,000 loan and started a 2-story Brooklyn chemicals factory that turned to morphine production, Pfizer and Company. Their competition, Edward Robinson Squibb, who was a naval officer who firsthand in the Civil War was throwing some of the adulterated morphine off the side of the ship and knowing it was no good, decided to start E.R. Squibb & Sons. 2 pharmacists out of Philadelphia, John and Frank Wyeth, say there's a business in there for us, and they start a chemical factory that's also producing enough morphine that's hard to meet the demand for it. Harvey Park and Park and Davis are 2 people who, one is a former sort of miner turned investor and decides to go into the drug trade because he sees the opportunity for drug to be made like morphine, and he gets a 26-year-old salesman who comes along with him, and you have Park Davis. And finally, you have Wellcome and Burroughs, and they are 2 American pharmacists as well. They aren't related. They decide the boom for morphine is big enough that they can get involved, but there's so much competition in the US, they go over and they open up shop in London in the UK. And this is a period, it's not just morphine that's feeding the business. These companies that we now know of in terms of Squibb, Eli Lilly, by the way, was a Union colonel. At the same time, after the Civil War, he missed the demand in the Civil War. He sets up his business and starts to do painkillers. So we have Lilly and Squibb, we have Wyeth, we have Pfizer, we have all of these companies that today we know. And the industry that they came into wasn't just built on pain and addictive products, but it was the wild west of drugs because anything went. There were no prescriptions required for any drug in the country. So you're 16 years old in most states, some required you to be 18. You could walk into a store, you could do mail order, and you can get everything from cannabis to cocaine. The companies competed on the quality of their cocaine to all types of opioids, including down a list you finally could run in terms of the types of drugs that were being used. And one of the things that's interesting, and cannabis as well throughout this period, one of the things that happened is, for instance, you could order for $1.50 from Sears and Roebuck, which was, I guess, the Amazon of its day, the biggest catalog in the world, a pure amount of cocaine and a hypodermic needle. So that was available for $1.50 to be able to come in. You could order pure opium tinctures, and they competed on the basis of the opium that would be given. Not much was known about what caused illnesses and disease. There was a great deal of ignorance. There was no national licensing for doctors until 1900. So many of the drugs that were being promoted were really almost like snake oil salesmen. They were cure-alls. They were supposed to cure everything. And guess what? There was no federal regulation. There was no requirement that they be safe. There was no requirement that they list on the label what was included. So one of the biggest selling drugs for about a 35-year period, during this period leading up to 1900, was Kopp's, K-O-P-P-S, Kopp's Baby Soother. It was the most popular lotion, sort of, cough medicine that could be given to babies to make sure they slept through the night. Now, what that company did was very clever marketing. They would go through the newspapers in the major cities. They would see mothers who had birth announcements, and then they would send a free sample to them. It turns out that it was about a third opium. Over time, enough babies died that finally that product was taken off the market. But this is the Wild West that these companies came into. One sidelight, because I'm talking here tonight at the Jewish Museum, and this is a couple of points will be footnotes from the book, but of interest, especially Jewish-centric issue. Bayer, the German pharmaceutical company, was far ahead of most of the American counterparts. The German companies had started in the mid-1600s as chemical companies, and they were further along. So Bayer, over a 5-year period from 1898 to 1903, they invent inside their labs 4 drugs. The first one they come up with is acetaminophen, what we know as Tylenol. The next year, they come up with aspirin, truly a wonder drug, one of the great drugs. Then a year and a half later, they come up with heroin. True, hard to imagine, named after the German word heroisch for heroic. They market it as a branded name, as a drug that goes on sale in the United States in 1900 as a cure for morphine addiction and as a way to keep babies also quiet at night. True. And the last thing is in 1903, they invent the entire class of barbiturates. Their branded name is phenobarbital. Now, the best part of this is that of those 4 drugs, the only one that Bayer decided not to put to the market and sell because they thought from their own internal tests it was too toxic was Tylenol, acetaminophen. That never got to the market, but heroin was fine, barbiturates was fine, and they also put aspirin out. The note for the Jewish Museum here is it's only a footnote inside my book, Pharma. The head of clinical pharmacology at Bayer was a fellow called Arthur Eichengrun. He had 47 patents to his name. He led the Bayer team that invented both acetaminophen and aspirin. In 1934, Bayer put out an official history of the company, and he's not listed. The credit for those discoveries is given to his assistant. The reason is because his assistant was a good Aryan German, and Eichenbrunn was Jewish. By 1934, Bayer had been purged of all of its Jewish scientists, over 200 of them, and he had been purged as well. In the official history that was written, he was left out. He appealed repeatedly to IG Farben, the big German industrial company entity of which Bayer was a part, and said, give me credit for these discoveries because this is what happened. And they ignored him. His reward, by the way, for being so persistent is he was sent to a concentration camp, which he survived. He died in 1948, still uncredited. It took a Scottish clinical pharmacologist in 1999 to finally get access to the old Bayer archives and go through all of their materials and establish conclusively for history that in fact it was the Jewish head of clinical pharmacology at Bayer, Eichengrun, who had developed both acetaminophen and aspirin. And so very belatedly, he has gotten the credit for it that he never got at the time. All of this unregulated Wild West period, I have some chapters in the beginning of the book about a fellow called Harvey Washington Wiley, a great itinerant preacher's son who becomes the head of the division of chemistry and wants to regulate food and drugs, and everybody thinks he's crazy. He forms a thing called the Poison Squad, which is volunteers who dress up in formal wear every night, and he feeds them food cooked in a kitchen, that makeshift kitchen that they make in the division of chemistry, fed with all types of additives and preservatives that they see if they're safe or not. That experiment finally stops after one of them dies, but they make enough headway that eventually, after a cough syrup kills 107 people in 1905, because it turns out it's mixed with an antifreeze component, most of them were children, Congress gets enough reason to pass the first law, and that's the 1906 Pure Food and Drug Act. Now, all that is a truth in labeling law. So you still don't have to have a safe product. You still don't have to do what you say you're going to do. You just have to say, if you're including opium, you better list it on the label. You're including heroin, put it on the label. Cannabis, put it on the label. It's all legal. Still no prescriptions required. The first case brought under that law is against Coca-Cola. And you say, what? All these products with opium, cocaine, and everything else, and they're going against Coca-Cola. That's because Wiley came from this background where he thought caffeine was the work of the devil. And they sued Coca-Cola saying, you haven't been truthful on your label because you have caffeine in the product and you don't have that on the label. And you're also not being truthful because you're called Coca-Cola. There's no coca, nothing from the coca plant in your product, and therefore it's misbranding. They lost that suit about a year later, not the greatest suit ever brought by the government. And so what changes the pharmaceutical business in the United States, by the way, isn't a law or regulation. It's a law not concerned about drugs, but we banned the importation of all narcotics in 1914 with a law called the Harrison Act. And then we go into that wild experiment where we ban alcohol because a lot of these drugs were made with alcohol bases. And suddenly the drug industry goes cold turkey. They have to figure out what they're going to do to earn their money. And what they end up doing, which is very interesting, is they're looking for something else. They're a small little niche player in the American corporate life. What I mean by that, Moody's, which many of you may know, ranks the size of American corporations and says these are the sectors and here's how large they are, started to do it in 1909. Pharmaceuticals was so small, they didn't even list it. It wasn't for 20 years. It was a subset of the chemical industry that pharmaceuticals were listed as their own. And they did discover insulin in 1922 up in Canada, and Lilly got the rights to distribute it, but that was it. And nothing changes until there's a sea change in World War II, and that's because of penicillin. There's no more important drug that comes along at any time than penicillin in World War II, and it literally is the birth of what we call the modern American pharmaceutical business. And very interesting, a sidelight on this, penicillin was really discovered in the late 1920s by a Scottish, a Scottish pharmacologist who's working inside his lab. He comes back from vacation and he looks at some of the plates that he uses, and some of them have a fungus growing along the edge that seem to be eating up bacteria. And he thinks to himself, maybe that could eat bacteria on bacterial infections, but he can't make anything of it. And it takes a decade later before a team at Oxford really starts to do it. But by then, World War II is getting underway. So Britain is at war with the Nazis from 1939 and on, and they're worried about a land invasion from Germany into Britain. So the people working on penicillin actually have a program where they decide that they're going to take the spores of penicillin, which could be this wonder drug, but they haven't really been able to produce it yet in big numbers. They're going to rub it into their suits and overcoats because these little brown spores will be invisible to see as a practical matter. And if the Nazis invade, that entire lab will go their own way. Everybody's splitting off in a different direction in the hope that one of them will be able to cross the border and get into Canada or get into the United States or somewhere else. And at that point, they will be able to resuscitate those spores, take them out, and recreate penicillin. So it turns out they have to come over to the United States, and they ask the US government to take on the penicillin project, and the government does it. And they actually make it the second biggest secret project of World War II after the atomic bomb. After the Manhattan Project, it's penicillin, which is at the top of the rank. The government takes 10 companies, including all the big ones that we know today, very different than what's happening with the COVID vaccine, where every company owns the rights to their own vaccine that they're working on and they'll make a profit on it. In this case, the government said, we're going to build out the plants for you to be able to manufacture this in record numbers. We'll build the fermentation tanks. We'll spend the tens of millions of dollars. But you, the pharma companies, you're going to share all the information, all the research. No one will own a patent on it. And then when it comes out, we'll get it to the troops and we'll get it to people and we'll save lives. And that's exactly what they did. By the end of the war, they went from zero to producing hundreds of billions of units a month. And they literally saved countless lives, both on the battlefields of Europe and in Asia, but also lives of those who were getting bacterial infections in the US. And the coming decade, by the way, becomes one where antibiotics are at the top of the heap. And this is where the drug industry comes into its own, because the drug industry in America gets a 17-year patent if it can come up with a new drug. So one of the things that they had to do in the 50s was come up with variations of what was penicillin, streptomycin, and with other drugs. So they would each come up with their own brand, and then they would brand it, and they would get a patent on it, and then they could sell it at a higher price, even though it was doing many of the same things penicillin was doing. As a sidelight, by the way, you might find it of interest to know that the three people who eventually won a Nobel Prize for the development of penicillin, one of them was Alexander Fleming, who's a Scottish pharmacologist. Another one's Howard Fleming. He was the Howard Florey, excuse me. He was head of the Oxford team. They both got knighted by the Queen. The third person was a German Jewish refugee, Ernst Chain, who had come over in 1933 to the UK, a brash, irascible, sort of brilliant fellow that nobody really liked too much, but clearly at the head of his game. In the middle of the war, he had said to his colleagues on the penicillin project, by the way, do you think we should patent this? They were horrified. As a matter of fact, they used his Judaism against him. They said, oh, you're money grubbing. That's disgusting. How could you think of putting a patent on a drug like this? It's for the better good, you know? And as a matter of fact, this will even look bad on all other Jewish immigrants who are coming into England if you can persist at doing this. Well, after the war, very clever American pharmaceutical companies figured out ways to make money on penicillin. They got what they called process patents, which are ways of making it a little bit faster, a little bit easier, a little bit quicker, a little bit less overhead. And once they get a patent on that process, you have to pay a royalty if you use that type of process in making the penicillin. So by the mid-50s in England, the people who invented penicillin and found it and brought it to us, were paying money to make the penicillin on which we had put those process patents. So that will teach them for being so highfalutin about thinking that they couldn't put a patent on it in the first place. And this is the period at which somebody comes into our orbit that we hadn't expected. You know, I always hoped that I could have told this story of the pharmaceutical industry through a family. So maybe it was possible that it was Johnson & Johnson or Squibb or Lilly, but it turns out that all of those in the second and third generation had dropped out of the business and they'd become large public companies. I always intended at the end of the book, Tricia and I had talked about this early on, to do a couple of chapters about the opioid epidemic because it was so significant, and about the Sackler family, the billionaire family that started from nothing that runs Purdue Pharma. But we never thought that they extended to the early days of the drug industry. And that's where we got pleasantly surprised. One of the things you do as a researcher on a book like this, because our books take a long time, I get the benefit of sending off to government agencies what's called a Freedom of Information request. It follows a legal process where you ask for records of people who are deceased. It takes a long time to get them, and eventually you get something back, and sometimes you hit gold, and sometimes you don't. It changes the nature of your research. And in this case, I ended up hitting gold, largely about what I call, this fellow, Arthur Sackler. That's not just a big poster I keep of him. That's a Sackler book he made for himself about his art collection, oversized in everything, including himself on his own book covers. And as a matter of fact, some of you might have just done like a double take. What was that? Was that a PowerPoint? No, that's the first handmade, sort of manually delivered PowerPoint. I fooled around with delivering PowerPoints inside of Zoom, and I'll tell you, you'll be happy I'm not doing it. It's an unmitigated disaster. So occasionally I might show something up to the screen. We got information about Arthur Sackler, and what we ended up getting was this wonderful part of what I call Freedom of Information files. They come in like this. They are often redacted. We got hundreds and hundreds of pages. And here's what we discovered about Sackler. He goes back to World War II. He was actually an informant for the FBI at a time when he was working for the German company Schering, and the FBI thinks of Schering's being a conduit for Nazis to South America. In the 50s, he goes to work for an advertising company that's doing medical advertising, and this is a non-existent business. We're accustomed to ads for drugs on TV. That didn't exist until 1997. This is a period at which the drug firms, to the extent they advertised at all, were running copies of the drug inserts, sort of the boring little packets, in a group of medical publications, and then those would be distributed to doctors over a period of time. It was a non-existent field. Arthur Sackler had a different idea. He knew that the business was dominated by white Anglo-Saxon Protestants. It was a waspy business. There were no Jews at the head of the American pharmaceutical business. And he bought, with his two brothers, a small drug company in the Lower East Side of New York called Purdue Pharma in 1952. It had Senecot, an herbal laxative, and a few other herbal products, but they didn't really manufacture anything from it. The Sackler brothers were the first in their family ever to go to college. They were Eastern European immigrants who came over here. They grew up in Brooklyn. All three became psychiatrists. The two younger brothers had to go to Glasgow, Scotland to get their medical degrees because the quota for Jewish students was filled when they tried to go to NYU. And what did Arthur Sackler decide to do? He was going to make the drugs in the 50s. He was going to show them how to sell them. And this is the man who revolutionized the way the drug industry, for good and for bad, marketed their drugs. He went to a fellow in 1957 who was running Pfizer at the time, Jack McKean, who was very, very hungry to make his antibiotic the #1 selling antibiotic in America. And Pfizer didn't have a very good antibiotic. They had a drug called terramycin. They had actually gone ahead and taken a competitor's drug, Lederle, a competitor, had a drug called Aramycin. Jack McKean and Pfizer took it and they changed one atom. That was all. One atom of difference is essentially the same drug. No difference in terms of the therapy it gives, no difference in terms of the way you dispense it. And yet Sackler said to him, I can make that the best-selling drug in the US if you give me $7 to $10 million to do an ad campaign. And most people thought he was insane, but not Jack McKean. He gave him the money. And what Arthur Sackler did is he did 4-color ads. He ran ads inside of Time magazine, which you weren't supposed to run to the public, but he said they're for doctors only. And he sent them to doctors' offices with inserts that they could cut out. He ended up developing the idea of sales teams, detail teams, men, all then men, and women eventually that went to doctors and tried to sell them personally, the idea of forming relationships and being friendlier with them. He was the one who came up with the idea of pharmaceutical swag, gifts to doctors. He was the one who first invented the idea of speakers bureaus, where doctors who were talking about drugs could be paid money to go off. So your doctor in New York in the middle of February, maybe you could be paid to go to Bermuda and talk to a conference of fellow doctors about how good this product was and this drug. He not only made that drug the top selling drug in America for Pfizer, but he revolutionized the business in doing it. And his business partners became a combination of a few other people. There's a guy called Ludwig Wolfgang Froelich, a German who came to the US in 1936. The FBI investigates him thinking he's a Nazi. He's not. He denies being Jewish. He joins some anti-Semitic clubs, becomes Arthur Sackler's partner. Arthur Sackler at the time was saying he's Catholic, even though he's not, obviously. He's a hardcore member of the American Communist Party, or his two brothers. They're hardcore socialists. And Ludwig Froelich changes his name to Bill Froelich. He's also hiding the fact that he's gay. He starts his own advertising firm. And the two of them are soon creating a company to try to track the number of prescriptions that doctors are writing so they can write ever more of them. And they join up with a psychiatrist who comes in from Spain, a fellow called Felix Martí Ibáñez. And together, the three of them are called to testify before Congress in '62. And guess what? Congress, I obtained the secret notes of the investigative squad that talk about a Sackler empire. The fact that the Sackler brothers had created a secret empire with interlocking secret ownerships in different companies, and they came away unscathed. They brought down the head of the FDA in a scandal that they have. And Arthur went on to not only sell Librium, which was the first benzodiazepine from Hoffman LaRoche, made it the #1 selling drug in America, but he made Valium, Hoffman LaRoche's follow-up to Librium, part of the American consciousness. The Rolling Stones sang about it in Mother's Little Helper, and Jacqueline Suzanne wrote about it in Valley of the Dolls. Arthur Sackler made Valium the first $100 million drug in the industry and the first $1 billion drug in the industry in terms of sales. And at the time, there's a fascinating story in there that I can only mention to you today, and that is he targeted women. There's a chapter we have called Targeting Women in there, in which he figures out how to get it prescribed by more than just psychiatrists. He wants it prescribed by the average general practitioner, and how women are particularly susceptible to having it prescribed because he's able to tell the doctors through all of these manuals and books, and he creates books that are sent off literally to all of the doctors in America, these short books that are prescribing novels that say essentially women are hysterical and neurotic, give them Valium and they'll be better housewives, and give Valium to men because it'll make them more competitive at work in bringing home the butter that they have to do and bringing home all the money that they need to make money for the family. So Sackler's marketing is truly diabolically genius. And eventually you will see the earmarks of it by the time you get to the opioid crisis. And what I mean by that is in the mid 60s, when Valium's selling off the charts through the roof, in England, there's a nurse turned doctor, Cicely Saunders, who has an idea to create hospice. She says, by the way, at the hospitals, I see these people dying of terminal cancer, and all we're doing is keeping them alive on pain every 4 hours with these painkillers. I'd like to send them home. Why can't we develop a program where they can go home and die with their families? And what was keeping her from doing that? By the way, she said that to another doctor when she was a nurse, and he said, no one will listen to you because you're only a nurse. You're not a doctor. So she said, okay, fine. And she went off and became a doctor as well. So she would have the gravitas to say it. And she was looking, holy grail for her was a long-acting pain killer that would allow those terminal One thing, if I can, remdesivir.
Oh, you're remdesivir, yeah.
Remdesivir, some of you will have heard about because Gilead, sort of a biotech company out of California, has it as a treatment for COVID. When they came out with that, they wanted to put it out as an orphan drug, which is ridiculous. I mean, if you understand, they were trying to game the system and make even more money on it. Me, Tricia, a number of us protested, were against that. They had to roll that back. But when they finally came out with a non-orphan drug for remdesivir and priced it about a month ago, if you read the article, they priced it for $2,200, $2,300 for the world, UK, France, everywhere else. In the US, the price is $3,300. They weren't embarrassed by that. They just announced that we will pay $1,000 more for the same treatment program, same course of treatment, same amount of drug than any other country on the planet. Why? Because they can, and they do. Yeah.
Thank you.
Our next question is from Morgan Benson, and she asks, what is your take on how Big Pharma and others are touting the speed of creating a COVID-19 vaccine when it took 39 years to create a polio vaccine? There's still no HIV vaccine, no Ebola vaccine, and a spotty flu vaccine. Are they capable of doing it so fast, or is it smoke and mirrors?
Ebola, there is a vaccine for Ebola. There is a vaccine.
Yeah,
for
just
now.
last year,
Just
there
last
finally
year
was. It took all that time. But you're right. You raised a great
you
question.
raised a very good question.
We're in contact every week, to the extent that they will still take our calls or that they answer them, with some of the infectious disease doctors we spoke to starting in 2016. They are all convinced to a person, and they're at research institutes, that we will get a very fast vaccine on this, because enough work had been done on coronavirus related vaccines beforehand in 2009, and then was stopped when they believe also, to a person, that there won't be just one vaccine. There'll be multiples. So when the first one gets across the finish line, if it's Johnson & Johnson or Pfizer or Moderna, the others aren't going to stop. They're already producing the actual vaccine to give out. And it's not going to be what the drug company calls one in, one out. One in, one out is like the polio vaccine. One shot. This is going to be a shot.
Like a flu shot.
Yeah, a little bit like a flu shot. Yeah. Like Trish said, influenza, meaning that you're going to build up some antibodies to it. You're going to get some T cell protectors. And then depending on how long that lasts, and if there's another spike at COVID at some point, and we don't have herd immunity yet, you might need to get a booster. Countries will have to stockpile it. So this is a multi-billion-dollar area. I told a newspaper reporter back in March or April that this is going to sound like a cold calculus. Tricia at the time winced when I said it, but later said, okay, I agree, that COVID-19 is the once in a generation business opportunity for Big Pharma. And it is for some of them.
We have another question from Frank Del Vecchio, who asks, what lessons from the pharma experience can be applied to the worldwide pandemic we are now experiencing?
Oh, I don't know. What would you say?
The first, for those of you who know Frank Del Vecchio,
hi, Frank.
We want to say hi because Frank is thanked in the book. He helped to do some of the proofreading at the end. The book is several typos are not there because he was able to catch them. English is a little better, so thank you, Frank. I wrote a piece for a thing called Literary Hub on how it's impossible to prepare for a viral pandemic. We can prepare for a bacterial one by trying to reduce antibiotic resistance, and that's different, but you can't stockpile a drug and be prepared for a virus which is a novel virus to which we have no natural immunity. And we all talk about being caught short with PPE. So we didn't have enough emergency care and everything else. But go to the UK or to Germany or to France or to the US or Canada and say to the people who are doing the health budgets, by the way, we want you to spend 10% of or 5% of your budget next year on stocking up on PPE for the next pandemic, which might be 30 or 40 years down the road. None of them are going to do it. They're going to spend it on triage and immediate stuff. So it's very, very hard to prepare for a viral pandemic. The only thing I wish they had done, Frank, is I wish the US government had not given out billions of dollars to these companies for their drug research without requiring that they share the research as they had on the penicillin project, and that they limit the amount of the price they could charge so they don't price gouge. And we gave them this money with no strings attached.
Thank you. Michael Davies asks, do you believe the Sacklers knew how addictive opioids would become and were intentional in the beginning?
So
it's a difficult. Yes and no.
Yeah, I mean, yes and no. When Trish says no, put it this way: the no part is, in the very beginning, they clearly knew that opioids were addictive, and the reason I say that with such certainty is, remember, the person running the company when the drug comes out in '96 is Raymond Sackler, Arthur's younger brother. He's a doctor.
Because Arthur's already passed.
He had passed already. The person who then later takes over the company is Richard Sackler, Raymond's son, who's also a doctor. So the Sacklers aren't just running the company, they have medical degrees. There was in the mid 80s, there was this sort of what I call reevaluation movement of some pain doctors. There was the birth of the pain movement, and they thought that opioids weren't as addictive as we had been told, and the pain was underdiagnosed. That's why when you go to a doctor, they often say, what's your pain level today, on top of your blood pressure and your heart rate? And they want to know
pulse,
and your pulse and your temperature. They want to know what your pain level is. So they focused more on pain. They downplayed the effects of the addictiveness, but the Sacklers and that company and the salespeople knew they were selling an addictive product.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
when they got the reports about levels of addiction and pill doctors and people selling more than they should, and the reports of death, you know what they did? They put it in the back room. They didn't call the FDA. They just hid it. So it's a disgraceful story. And it's, look, there's other parts of the drug industry. There's Cyril hiding evidence of blood clots and cancer in women on the first oral contraceptive put out in
Absolutely.
1960. There's Wyeth, you wrote about in your book,
Women's,
hormone replacement,
hormone replacement,
hiding the cancers and heart-related deaths on the first HRT products. So, you know, it's not new, but on this particular product, it's addictive and it can kill you,
They
and it
knew
has.
better. Yeah, they did know better.
Yeah. And on that same topic, Alex Rankin asks, what is the status of the Sackler family lawsuit or court case?
Oh, good. Yeah, it's going on right now, right?
For those of you who don't know, Alex Rankin is an archivist, a chief archivist at the Howard Gottlieb Archival Center at Boston University, where Trish and I send all of our research papers after every book. And Alex, we have a whole basement filled with papers and documents coming to you soon. The Sacklers, just for you to know, it will seem strange. Purdue Pharma, the company, filed bankruptcy protection last September. The Sacklers are worth billions of dollars. And I'm not just saying that.
14 billion?
Yeah, exactly. 14 billion. In 2015, Forbes put them on the richest families in America list at $14 billion. Forbes called them the Oxy Clan. They made all of their money from OxyContin. And now the Sacklers went before the bankruptcy court and said, oh, Your Honor, we aren't bankrupt, obviously. We've got a lot of money, but we'd like you to protect us against a couple of thousand lawsuits that have been filed, because we don't want to go forward, and maybe we'll contribute some money to an overall settlement with the states and all the thousands of people that have sued. So they've offered $3 billion. And nobody really knows how many billions they'll walk away with. And the question is, will this bankruptcy judge, who has extraordinary powers, and the Justice Department allow them to walk away without paying any price? There will be no report at the end. There will be no judgment, nothing said about responsibility, no apology for what's ever happened. They'll write a check. They'll keep the bulk of their money. They'll still be able to go to the country clubs. And I just don't think that's justice. And I think a lot of other people don't as well.
Moving a little bit towards the political, Kevin Moriarty asks, do you have any sense of whether stronger regulation of the pharma business is a priority in the current Democratic platform?
I don't know.
I think so. I mean, look at
maybe.
What did we say used to scare pharma executives? Elizabeth Warren and Bernie Sanders, right? The idea that there they saw people who were going to come in with policy ideas and say, we're going to change the business. You know, in the early 1960s, they thought about limiting the federal government thought about limiting the 17-year patent to more like what Europe has, 5 years or 8 years. Force the companies to license to all comers after a few years at a fixed percentage. That never passed. So the problem is the lobbying. And when I say that, sometimes people say to the two of us, is this book more against Democrats or Republicans? And it's
equal opportunity.
Yeah, it's a pox on both your houses. Yeah. And what I mean by that is at different times, I can one decade point to the Republicans and say they help pharma more, and another decade is Democrats. When the first $8.3 billion bill was signed this year in March to give to the drug companies $3 billion for drug research for COVID vaccine, there were two clauses in the first draft that included they had to share the information, no intellectual property right ownership, and they had a cap on their pricing. And when that $8.3 billion was passed a week later, both of those clauses were out. So Democrats and Republicans had to sign off on that. Both parties are lobbied heavily by the drug company, and both have been too compliant with them over the years, unfortunately.
Thank you. And on the other end of that spectrum, We have a question from Scott Samuels who asks, President Trump's executive order is supposed to protect Medicare from paying more for drugs than any other developed country. Will this help?
Yes, it will. It will help significantly if it actually gets into place. So it's been rolled out in the last couple of months. It has to go through a vetting process, and drug companies are already preparing litigation to file suits against it. And as a result, I don't think it will get done at least until the next administration. And then we'll have to see to what extent, if it's a Biden administration, they pick up and try to push that in. It's not going to be done right away. It's going to take some time to get in, because Medicare and Medicaid have been cash cows for the drug companies, without any doubt.
Thank you. We have another question from one of our staff members at the Jewish Museum, Erica Corsano, and she asked, you briefly spoke about orphan drugs. What can we do to influence the regulation and encourage their development?
There hasn't really been. It's a difficult one, isn't it?
It's
a very tough one.
It is a tough one, but I think that there are some things. The drafters of the legislation of the orphan drug law did not mean for it to be used the way that it's been used. So
to be abused.
A perfect case is Allergan with Botox. Botox is one of the most successful commercial drugs in the world. Largely been used for, its biggest success has been for cosmetic purposes, used by doctors, for which it's approved by the FDA. But that's not what it was originally approved for. It was originally used to treat spasms inside the eye, and then later inside the throat, as an orphan drug. So it affected fewer than 200,000 people. As a result of orphan drug status, it was able to get an extended patent. It got tax credits. It got special tax subsidies. They get all types of a rollout, fast approval. Then it got a number of subsequent approvals as orphan drug. And eventually it became approved for a general purpose, far more than 200,000 people. At that point, you would think that the government would require Allergan to give all of its previous benefits back to the government.
Yeah.
You've gotten all these benefits for a drug that was supposed to be for a very small purpose of a genetic disease, and now you've turned it into a multi-billion-dollar profit maker. But that's how the drug companies work, even to the extent when they're able to take a drug that's been successfully marketed as an orphan drug, they will then cut it into a smaller field like family, pediatric version, and they raise the price and they get a new patent on it. If you see the way that it's been misused, remember Martin Shkreli, who went to jail eventually. That was an orphan drug he was dealing with. He didn't go to orphan drugs by accident.
But that is still the same price now.
Yeah.
That's what people don't seem to realize. Even though he went to jail, the people that took it, it's the same price.
That's right. He went to jail on, securities fraud. He was the evil face incarnate of raising the price of a drug used by AIDS patients to thousands of times what it was otherwise. The company that he left behind kept that price at the same high level.
Thank you. And we are just about at time, actually a little bit over. So I'd like to close with this question from Morgan Benson. And Morgan touches on some of both of your previous works. Bayer changed their name in World War II because their previous name was too German sounding. How many big pharma companies today have ties to the Nazi regime, and how did they get away, if they did, with anything they did during the Holocaust?
Well, IG Farben.
Yeah, IG
Farben.
Yeah.
Really? I mean, how many changed their names, really?
I mean, Farben, you think of it, was dissolved. Farben was the big German conglomerate, dissolved at the end of the war.
But they have Monowitz.
Yeah.
And they had the Monowitz in Auschwitz, slave labor camp.
Bayer had slave labor camps inside there. The American-German companies, by the way, Shearing, that Arthur Sackler worked for, and the others, were seized by the U.S. government. We had a thing called the alien custodian, property custodian here. They seized it. And as a matter of fact, a sidelight to this that you might find of interest, when the American companies seized Bayer in America and took away their rights, they also took away the patent to aspirin. And so as a result, everybody was able to produce aspirin. Bayer's way of keeping its brand to it was to say Bayer genuine aspirin. If you
Genuine
look at the
aspirin, yeah.
bottles on you go to Walgreens or to Duane Reade or wherever else, you'll see Bayer genuine aspirin. The others will just say aspirin. It's the same exact ingredient, but it runs about 3 times the price as the generic. So they've still been able to run their reputation for a better product, or a pricier product, I should say.
Thank you. And we do actually have some breaking news that Edward Beach has sent, that the Department of Justice is having a press conference tomorrow on Purdue.
Oh,
And Ed Bish, who is one of those persons who lost a son that I've met, has been a great source of keeping Trisha and me on fire as well.
amazing person.
He will be happy to know that I have an op-ed sitting in a couple of newspapers. I'm trying yet another one to get a story out about why a deal should not be struck with Purdue before the election. All right. Thank you.
Fantastic. Thank you both. And thank
Thank
you,
you.
Gerald, for this fascinating topic and discussion. And I'll hand it off to our Executive Director, Susan Gladstone.
Well, thank you very much. I just want to also thank you. This was really interesting, and I'm thinking we may have to have part 2 if you're willing. Because
He'll do it.
a lot more information that we could learn from you. This was just fascinating. And to all of our guests, if you enjoyed your experience this evening, I'm going to echo something that Gerald said in his beginning of his speech. Please go to our website. Luna, if you could type it in for us in the chat, and become a member. If you're already a member, please renew your membership. If you're not yet a member, please join our family. We really, really want to be, as I said earlier, the best virtual museum we can be, and it's only with your help that we'll be able to continue to do so. And Gerald and Trisha, thank you so much for joining us this evening.
Thank you for having us.
Thank you. Thank you for having us. Bye-bye.